Welcome to Lethal Dose, your favorite toxicology-focused podcast where we delve into true crime cases involving drugs and poisons. My name is Venus Dineko. I'm a layperson fascinated by true crime.
My name is Kayla Woods. I'm an author and toxicologist.
Let's get started. Content warning for this episode, discussions of suicide. So, what is the topic of discussion today and where are we headed?
So today we're talking about another pesticide, which we haven't spoken about, I don't think, on the main channel specifically, but we've talked about it like a number of times on Patreon, and I've alluded to it a couple of times here and there, I think. And we're going back to Japan in the 1980s.
Let's go.
Let's go. So on April 30th, 1985, Haruo Otsu was leaving for a fishing trip and decided to stop beforehand for drinks at a vending machine in Tokyo. He bought a bottle of vitamin-rich health drink Oronamin C, but when he reached into the dispenser, he found 2 bottles. At the time, the Otsuka company which produced Oronamin C was doing a promotional deal where sometimes people would get 2 bottles of the drink when they purchased one from a vending machine, and it was just sort of a gambly-like marketing gimmick.
Like maybe buy one, get one free.
Possibly, yeah.
Possibly.
But sometimes people didn't want the second one, like when we all got the free U2 album and not everybody wanted that. And so they would leave their second drink on top of the vending machine as just like a pay it forward act of kindness. Like, here's a free drink, you don't have to buy yours.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, halfway through drinking his second bottle on his trip, Haruo began to feel sick, and a couple of hours later he was taken to a hospital in his hometown of Tondabayashi, and the next night he died. Between April 30th and November 17th, 35 people were poisoned and 12 people total died, including 52-year-old Haruo Otsu, a 12-year-old boy, a 30-year-old farmer, a 44-year-old woman, and a man named Takashi Sakai, who became violently ill within 30 minutes of drinking an Oronamin C and died after suffering in the hospital for 6 weeks.
So this is like a mass poisoning situation? Wow. Okay.
And it wasn't the first time in recent history that Japan specifically had been victimized by product tampering. In the spring of 1984, a group identifying as the Monster with 21 Faces tried to extort the Morinaga Corp and 3 other candy manufacturers by lacing chocolates and candy with cyanide. The monster then put these candy on the shelves with labels that said contains poison, and so no one was hurt. But, I mean, they were still putting them on the shelves.
Putting it on the shelves, right.
Anybody could have grabbed them. And then the group sent a letter to the police in early 1985 to let them know they weren't going to poison candy anymore, which, like,
This
don't
is
know.
odd.
It's odd to be like, we're not going to do it anymore, but it's also like, would I trust that, or are they just, like, leveling up? But
Right.
But they actually were, like, they actually did stop with their poisoning. Like, whatever protest they were doing was over. But then there was a bad batch of wine that was imported by Austria, and it had antifreeze added to it as a preservative. The Japanese,
Is that a thing?
It's not supposed to be a thing. That's super illegal.
Like, okay, I was like, is this like a standard practice of adding antifreeze as a preservative that I don't know about?
Luckily, no. And so the Japanese government removed the wine from the stores, but the importer in Japan, named Man's Wine Co., mixed the wine in with domestic wine so that they wouldn't have to take a loss on the import. So they were just mixing this antifreeze wine into their,
Just diluting it, essentially.
Yeah. And luckily, no serious injuries were reported from this either. But still, it's like they've had a lot of health scares, and now there's these 35 people in Japan who've been poisoned. And all of the people poisoned in Japan at this time, except one, were found to have been poisoned with Paraquat, while the outlier was poisoned with Diaquat. They were in bottles of Oronamin C, which had been tampered with by an unknown individual taking advantage of the marketing gimmick, but other bottles were also poisoned and left near the vending machine, including Coca-Cola and Real Gold. So Paraquat, what they had been poisoned with, is a pesticide and herbicide which was developed in the 1950s and was first used commercially in the 1960s. It functions by disrupting cell membranes and interfering with photosynthesis on contact with plants. So it's a lot like how Agent Orange was supposed to be in terms of its defoliant capabilities.
Yep.
And it causes them to visibly wilt and die within a few hours. And it does this by inhibiting the conversion of NADP to NADPH, which is just a coenzyme that helps with metabolism that I'm sure everybody who just finished up with their chemistry finals is real triggered right now by hearing those letters.
Gotcha.
And this is similar to the mechanism of toxicity for this pesticide in humans, which we'll get to later. But the way that it acts on plants is similar. Unlike some other pesticides, though, Paraquat rapidly deactivates upon contact with soil, so there's no bioaccumulation. So there's a benefit in that way. However, when ingested orally or usually via inhalation during spraying of Paraquat, it's extremely likely to be fatal. It's super fatal. So despite the immediate danger that these tamperings were posing to their customers, the Japan Soft Drink Bottlers Association chose not to adjust the packaging of the bottles to be tamper-resistant, as was done only a couple years earlier during the 1982 Tylenol poisonings. Rather, a spokesperson for the association said that since the seal on the screw cap needed to be broken on the bottles for tamperings to have occurred, the producers didn't actually need to do anything, and instead, consumers needed to be more cautious. All right. 7 people died during the Tylenol poisonings, and it's considered one of the most notorious cases of tampering in the world. And yet, they pushed back after the death of 12 people. And this was because they had tried to argue that the deaths were more likely suicides rather than murder.
Interesting. So they were trying to just completely flip the script here and say that it was something that it was not.
Yes, yes. And the reason they did this, I think specifically, is because Paraquat was fairly often used for suicide. Paraquat was used for 1,402 suicides in Japan alone the year before, in 1984. And Japan wasn't alone, because globally, around 20% of suicides are carried out via self-poisoning with pesticides. And that's a number that is active even today, because a lot of the low-income countries have easy access to pesticides, and a lot of the higher income countries use firearms or hanging, is usually how we kill ourselves. So in 1984, it was actually a particularly common way to attempt suicide, especially in Asian countries and Latin America.
Right, but I mean, a 12-year-old boy.
I know. It's such a stretch. It's such a stretch. Yeah. Okay. But they were still Paraquats usually used to kill themselves, so it's not on us. These people are choosing to do this, which, god damn, what an argument. So the manufacturers knew this, and the manufacturers of Paraquat also knew that it was dangerous and often used for suicide. In 1964, only 2 years after Paraquat was on the global market for commercial agriculture in a product called Gramoxone made by the Imperial Chemical Industries, there were already reported poisonings in Ireland and New Zealand. Soon thereafter, suicides accounted for the majority of Paraquat deaths globally. Part of the reason for these high rates of suicide is because there is no antidote for Paraquat exposure, and thus the fatality rate for known exposures is estimated to be as high as 70%.
Wow.
By the mid-80s, Japan was seeing more than 1,000 deaths a year from Gramoxone alone. Not all of them, of course, were intentional, as was the case worldwide, because a kid could easily ingest a small amount in a water bottle that was used to spray rather than a huge spraying device. And you could die pretty quickly and painfully from this because the estimated LD50 is a mere 30 to 35 milligrams per kilogram. It's about a mouthful.
That's it.
That's it.
And you're done.
And that's the 20% solution, because I don't think they ever put anything higher than 24% on the market.
Oh, wow.
So
if it was in its full blown, it would take a dropper, a drop, essentially.
Yeah. And I mean, God, I don't even know what it would do to plants. Just melt them and
right, just turn them into dust.
Yeah. So even according to a 1987 internal document from the Imperial Chemical Industries, or ICI, they addressed their, quote, Paraquat poisoning problem, and they recognized that the mouthful could result in death, And then they also noted that low doses induced prolonged and unpleasant death from lung fibrosis because of the inhalational exposure, usually.
Mm-hmm.
But at higher levels, as would be expected in a suicide attempt, higher even than oral ingestion accidentally, of course, death occurs more quickly following multiple organ failure. It's a terrible way
Oh,
to go.
yeah, that's fucked.
But what they failed to mention is that paraquat is caustic and corrodes the GI tract when ingested orally, which leads to mucosal lesions in the mouth and a symptom called paraquat tongue that presents within a few days if you survive that long. And this causes ulcers on your tongue that bleed, and they can also develop in the esophagus and lead to esophageal perforation.
Oh, fuck.
Yeah, it sounds awful.
This is awful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. The chemical isn't readily absorbed in the stomach and instead perfuses into the lungs, kidneys, liver, and muscles. Paraquat generates a superoxide anion, which is something that usually helps aerobic organisms to signal processes like apoptosis. But in cases of toxins, these force the production of anions, and more toxic reactive oxygen species, which are known to cause cancer, are formed. So now you have these free radicals, and that's what like blueberries and antioxidants and shit are supposed to like help with. But, it's not going to be on this level, obviously. We'll talk about free radicals some other time, but essentially they're linked to developing cancer later on down the road. More immediately, though, the oxygenated species cause oxidative damage to the liver, and then renal failure can develop quickly and is completely irreversible.
Yeah, this is all happening so quickly. Like, that sounds like such a terrible way to go.
It is. It is.
Yeah, not in my top tier ways to go.
No,
No.
like,
No.
I mean, as we've said before, like, people can do whatever they want with their lives, but, like, I don't recommend this. This sounds awful.
Yeah.
Like,
Fuck that.
it burns on the way down, and then, like, you can spend hours or weeks just, like,
Yeah, that's what I was
languishing.
gonna say. Like that one guy, 6 weeks in the hospital. Fuck.
Yeah.
Like going through multiple organ failure. No, thank you.
No, thank you. Yeah, I don't recommend this one, friends. Maybe take a nap and see if you feel better after that.
Yeah. Talk to a friend.
Yeah.
Get a pet.
The product manufacturers weren't going to do anything. And so what the Japanese authorities decided to do in response to the tampering after, all of these people experienced all of these upper level poisonings, because I'm sure they drank quite a bit. It wasn't like a low level exposure for most of them. So what they decided to do in 1985 was print sticker warnings to put onto vending machines, which read that, you should check the dispensing bin
The
before.
zeal.
Right. And that you should avoid drinking any of the abandoned drinks that people leave behind. And then they handed out leaflets through the city that warned people more generally, like, hey, there's something going on with the vending machines.
Huh.
There was brief consideration given to stricter monitoring of the vending machines, but nothing really happened with that. And this is mostly because video surveillance wasn't like great or widespread in the 80s,
Sure.
but also because Japan had 5.2 million vending machines that were at risk of this tampering. So there's no way you can
Yeah,
watch
they're
them all.
everywhere.
Yeah.
They're everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's not a likely solution. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
So instead, vending machine operators were asked to like check the contents of their machines, and then drugstores and retailers of herbicides and other poisons were asked to keep an eye out for suspicious purchases, because at this point they are still using the 24% solution, and it's not being restricted really. Like, it's not restricted to commercial use or anything. And then, of course, there were the copycats. So copycats left tainted containers of milk at the Mai Prefecture schools in central Japan in December of 1985. But luckily, I don't think anyone was hurt in this copycat case. And then eventually, the Otsuka company did change the type of bottle cap on the Oronamin C bottles. And the vending machine poisoning stopped, not because of the bottles, probably because of the stickers, and just everybody knew that there was poisonings happening. But the perpetrator was never identified. This is still like an unsolved case.
An open case, yeah.
And in 2001, Japan abolished their statute of limitations for murder, meaning that if the poisoner or poisoners are ever caught, they can still be prosecuted for this.
Interesting. I mean, it's funny that if you're thinking about the poison, like, why wouldn't they just stopped, didn't they? Like, This
Yeah, they just stopped.
wasn't an ongoing. Yeah, they just stopped because I was gonna say like they would just move on to a different drink that doesn't have a different type of bottle cap or something.
Yeah.
But it seems it was just a short-lived little adventure that they had,
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah,
Like,
poisoning
let me
35
poison
people.
Yeah, poison. That's enough. That's enough. I'll stop now.
Right, right.
Like,
And
huh.
so this was kind of a short case in itself. I couldn't find a whole lot, maybe because a lot of the sources are like in Japanese and they just weren't coming up in my search, but there's just not a whole lot about this. But while I was digging into it, I found more about paraquat because I was like, why was it so easy to get something that was like this toxic?
This deadly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it turns out that even though there's a crime in itself with people literally poisoning someone, there was a crime behind the scenes with the manufacturer of Paraquat, with ICI.
Do tell.
So ICI sought, again, a solution to their problem with Paraquat, where people are killing themselves, and such a problem to us.
Right.
They decided to look for a solution in 1968, well before any of these poisonings in Japan. And they determined that adding an emetic to gramoxone would be the best idea, much like how solutions of ethanol for like cleaning are denatured with methanol to keep people from drinking it, which by the way doesn't work. It just poisons people in a different way. We kind of talked about it on Patreon. We'll probably talk about it again. Not a good idea. But this was more like them saying like, let's add Epicac to it, and there's a lot of things I think that have emetics added to them. But at this time, 1968, ICI decided that it was too expensive to add anything else to their gramoxone solution.
Okay.
And so they kept saying, okay, we have a problem. What about this emetic? No. Okay, is there no problem? No, there's still a problem. What about this emetic? No. So they kept going back and forth, and they did that a couple times.
But never did anything about it.
But they never did anything about it. And people kept dying from ingestion of their pesticide. Like, thousands of people every year. Like, it was a big deal with this specific product. It wasn't until the US EPA considered removing gramoxone from the market in 1975 because they were so concerned about its rampant lethality that the ICI decided to do something. And they just kind of like heard about this being a possibility. They weren't warned about it. And 2 weeks after they learned about the EPA's plan to cancel the production and sale of Paraquat, they suddenly began adding an emetic. Easy peasy, we have an emetic now. And this emetic was called PP796. I don't think it was ever used for anything else commercially, and so it was never given a fancy name. It was a drug that was used for the treatment of asthma, but one of the side effects was that it induced vomiting. So, like, not a great asthma treatment drug.
Not a great asthma. I was just going to say that does not, like, well, I can breathe, but now I'm throwing up.
Yeah,
like,
I can breathe when I'm not gagging.
Gagging, yeah. Like, I can breathe between the heaving.
Yeah.
Like,
So ICI determined that they would add 0.05% PP796 by volume to the gramoxone, as well as a blue dye and a stenching agent.
What's that?
So a stenching agent is just something that smells bad. So
Gotcha.
It's like bright blue. It doesn't look like food. I mean, it probably kind of looks like candy, but it's bright blue. It smells terrible, and it makes you throw up. So they're like,
okay,
that should be it.
That should do the trick.
And then what they decided to do was take the next step, because capitalism, and they patented the emetic that allowed them to show regulators they were serious about preventing deaths, but it also made it so that they essentially cornered the market on a safe paraquat solution because now the regulators were saying, do you have this emetic? And eventually...
To the other paraquat manufacturers.
Right.
Gotcha.
And eventually, the Food and Agricultural Association of the UN, or the FAO, required that 0.05% PP796 be in all solutions of paraquat as an international standard for pesticides. But unfortunately, the inclusion of PP796 did not make gramoxone any safer.
But let's make sure that we use it. Everybody has to have it. It doesn't work, but everybody get on board.
All of the research done regarding the emetic effects of PP796 were done in the 60s and 70s and were recorded on microfiche, which was referenced to determine the 0.05% amount. However, no original human research was done in the 80s, and all of the original records had been destroyed, so there's no going back to look at them. And all they had to work on was done in dogs and monkeys, from which senior scientist at ICI named Michael Rose extrapolated his number for humans, a number that he estimated would be lower than for animals because he said that humans would be more sensitive to it. But based on what? Like, what?
Right.
Based on what? You weren't looking at humans. You didn't do your own original research. You're just, like, literally drawing a curve and saying, here's dogs and here's pigs, and I think humans fall somewhere.
Humans are here. Yeah, he's like throwing darts at a board, going here, right about here.
Fucking basically.
And it wasn't working, like, because wouldn't it still have its caustic effects on the mouth?
Yes.
Even with the emetic? Like,
yes.
Right.
Yeah, that won't stop it. And so,
yeah.
Like, I don't know that... I just don't know how it was being reported, because for deaths were still being reported, and we are getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, but I will answer your question. Deaths were still being reported, but I think that, like, the FAO wasn't, like, getting that data or something. They're just like, well, there's an emetic in it. It must be safer. But internally, there was still issues. So there was a colleague at Chevron Chemical who was a manufacturer and distributor of ICI's Paraquat. And he pointed out, because he was on the inside and was working with it, that the available human studies of ingestion of PP796 showed that no one had vomited in the 15-minute window they were expected to. Like, they were given PP796.
And literally nobody puked.
They just waited. And then this same scientist, Dr. Richard Cavalli, he didn't think that the EPA would even accept the addition of PP796 based on the data. And initially, he was actually correct, because nothing was happening with this emetic. So in 1977, an EPA chemist wrote to Chevron and said that, quote, there are better ways of inducing vomiting, tickling the throat with a finger, for example. But by 1978, ICI was selling gramoxone with PP796 emetic in other countries, international under the FAO, in hopes that it would encourage the U.S. regulators to choose to help keep Paraquat for sale, ideally with their preparation. In 1981, ICI scientists, internal scientists, had enough data to write in a company memo that, quote, at best, only a few people have survived Paraquat poisoning because of the inclusion of this emetic. And that, quote, the early onset of emesis after ingestion of Paraquat does not play a part in reducing mortality. Further...
Yeah, it's still fucking caustic. Oh, further. Oh, God.
Well, and if you want to read this is something that ICI chemist Peter Slade wrote.
It is important that undue hope should not be raised for what PP796 can achieve toxicologically, and equally that registration authorities not be actively misled into thinking that the emetic formulation will quote-unquote solve the Paraquat problem. Ugh.
I know. So now you have all this internal stuff, and everybody internally is like, this isn't working. This is not working. And then everybody up top basically is like, but it's working in other countries. So, yeah. And then somehow, nobody wants to point fingers and figure out how they got this, but the EPA received information from someone that enabled them to conclude that there was not available data to suggest that Paraquat sold with the Chevron ICI preparation should be banned, and so Paraquat was returned to its normal registration process with the EPA in 1982. In 1984... Another ICI scientist suggested that the PP796 be increased by 5-fold in order to induce vomiting within 5 minutes of ingestion of gramoxone, and that would help to avoid absorption and exposure, because it can't permeate through the body and get into the muscles and the lungs. But this wasn't done. The following year...
Do you think it would have worked if they increased it?
What do you think? I want to know what
I don't think so.
Why?
I don't think so. Because it's already, soaked up in the bloodstream enough. It's lethal enough. I think that if it's in your system for 5 minutes, the deed is done. I don't know.
I like the way you think. I think you've heard a couple of episodes of this podcast, maybe. Yeah, we'll get to what I think. Don't worry. I have a whole rage that I have at the end. So, the following year, Japan is terrorized with the Oronamin C poisonings, and consumers were blamed for their own injuries and deaths at the hands of a perpetrator who was never identified. But no one was really wanting to do anything to save their lives. ICI maintained in internal documentation that many of the reported accidents were actually suicides, which indicated a greater amount was ingested than in a genuine accident, and that suicide was more of a social issue than anything, which wouldn't be solved by withdrawing Paraquat from the market. Yeah. Even despite their own chemists' findings about the efficacy of PP796, in their internal memos 3 years later, they still reported that it helped to reduce mortality. And of course, this is just because of profits. They didn't want Paraquat to be pulled from the market, but they also didn't want to have to change the formulation of their product in any way. And they pitched this as being concerned for the integrity of their products for the farmers who used it. But in reality, they just didn't want to lose profits because in a 1987 memo, they stated that diluting the solution would increase packaging costs and as a result would decrease profits because farmers would be less likely to use it at a diluted concentration that they would need more of at a greater cost. Unsurprisingly, considering that in 1987 ICI was selling Paraquat products under different names and with different formulations in 140 countries, and resulting in 15,000 tons of Paraquat being sold worldwide. They were earning they were earning approximately 200 million pounds or $376 million, and this is in 1987.
Holy shit. Yeah, that's they don't want to mess with the cash cow.
They really don't. And then comes John Halings. He was an ICI junior scientist in 1990 and was working to reduce the lethality of the Paraquat products, despite that they're maintaining in documentation that it's not lethal, but suicide's more of a social issue thing, whatever.
Right.
He's looking at Michael Rose's old data that he used to justify the 0.05 PP796 value. You know, the one that was used on non-original studies from pigs and dogs and not humans. Beyond what I've already told you about that poor science and that poor use of the curve, Haling also realized that Rose had essentially cherry-picked data, and that even according to Rose's own calculations, a reasonable amount of PP796 to add to gramoxone for efficacy would be 10 times more than has been added to it since 1976.
Oh my God.
And this is even
the first time a person looks into it.
Right.
Like the first time somebody checks this guy's math.
Yeah.
Like.
And of course, he was still approximating how closely people were like pigs, and he knew he was underestimating the amount needed to stop thousands of people from dying from accidents and suicide attempts. And it's very likely he underestimated this because of profit margins, because PP796 costs 8 times more to produce than Paraquat by volume. But this only means that per liter of Paraquat, they would have had to pay 63 cents more to increase the safety of their product in 1990.
That's literally nothing when you're raking in $376 million.
I know. Interestingly, the company did not suffer significant financial losses when, the year after the Oronamin C poisonings, Japan suspended the sale of 24% Paraquat and replaced it with a Paraquat diquat solution that was only 4% Paraquat and 4% diquat, and this was called Preglox. This is also despite the fact that diquat, like PP796, is more expensive to produce than Paraquat, and they're putting it in at 4%. Like, it's so easy. It's so easy.
They're so close. Like, they're almost there.
And after Haling reported his findings on gramoxone to his superiors, he did work on an improved version of gramoxone called gramoxone that contained what he approximated was an appropriate level of emetic. And this was still based on animals, so still not great, but it was still more. Like, he was trying his best to make a safe product.
Right. Like, he had good intentions. This guy, it seems.
Yes, this one guy.
He had the best of intentions. Like,
maybe a couple of the others who were like, hey, this isn't working out, but also this guy.
Yeah.
More importantly, maybe, than the emetic, though, is that he added an agent which would cause the contents of the stomach to congeal so that the body couldn't absorb the Paraquat.
Okay.
So following the release of gramoxone, there was a 2008 study in Sri Lanka that suggested that this formulation was marginally safer. But I will point out that this study was designed funded, and led by Syngenta, which is the parent company now of ICI. So that's a little sus.
Yeah.
And I did see some of the authors that I had seen in other independent studies of Paraquat, but it's like, this is still being funded and designed and led by the people who have an interest
creator
in making the Intian version look better.
Yeah. Yeah.
Also, when you look into their data, their findings were that maybe 30 more people survived Intian over standard gramoxone over whatever period of time they were looking at. I think it was like 3 years or something. And they were including possible and probable ingestions of gramoxone in their study, which maybe makes it seem like that could just be attributed to not knowing completely if Paraquat played a role in the situations where those 30 people survived. So I don't know. I'm a little suspicious of that data. Oh yeah, so between 1994 and 2000, that's when ICI demerged and remerged and named itself Syngenta, which identifies itself as the first global group focusing exclusively on agribusiness. And Syngenta maintains publicly that product safety is important to them, and they never prioritized profits over people, nor did they ever fabricate or misrepresent data. They claimed the inclusion of the emetic, the dye, and the stenching agent helped to address the problem. But then it's like, why did you create the Intian then? Like later on.
Right.
They also added labeling to discourage improper paraquat use and storage, and they helped to train some 42 million farmers on proper use and storage. Furthermore,
almost all modern innovations, buildings, bridges, railways, pharmaceuticals, automobiles, machines, and crop protection products have been used for suicide. We believe that society needs to address the root cause and focus on mental health issues, not deprive the world of important technology, which has improved overall human well-being.
Thoughts on that one?
I mean, they're basically saying, like, we need to make suicide not a problem because you can kill yourself so many different ways. Like, why are you going to single us out?
Why are you... Yeah.
Like, that's what I'm hearing. I mean, look at all of these other ways you could kill yourself, and yet people are allowed to drive a car and walk on a bridge.
Well, and it's as if we haven't made buildings, railways, pharmaceuticals, and cars safer and harder to kill yourself with. Like,
yes, like there are literally like bridges that like have posts up, like and have fences up, and have like.
Yeah. So obviously this is just a disingenuous argument to pass the buck on mental health.
Yeah.
But when the method of injury is made more difficult to access, which should be a surprise to nobody, it prevents accidents, suicides, and homicides. Like, if you don't have access to it, you can't kill people with it as easily.
Right. Like, and wouldn't you want your product to be safer?
Wouldn't you?
Like, wouldn't you?
They don't, because it means fewer people are buying it. Yeah. And we have data on this because after the suspension of the 24% Paraquat solution to the lower percent solution with Diquat in 1986, sales of Paraquat and Diquat both fell. And this was probably because consumers were also forced to show ID and sign their name in a registry when purchasing the chemicals. So they fell because they were harder to access. And nobody wants their profits to fall, even if it means people aren't going out and killing themselves. Between 1986 and 2019 in Japan, there was a 92% reduction in deaths from parasite poisonings overall. And this was including organophosphate and carbamate pesticides, but there were only 67 other pesticide deaths in 2019, and that's generally where Paraquat gets kind of like pushed into, is with other pesticides. So it's like from 1,000 in 1984 to 67, like, that's a nice reduction.
That's a huge reduction.
Yeah. And it's likely that the restrictions on sales are more likely to have been what helped reduce deaths than the change of formulation, because even the 4% Paraquat solution still has a 70 to 80% fatality rate because there's no antidote for it. So if you're...
Right, and refresh my memory, did they add the substance that would make it congeal in your stomach? Did they end up adding that?
That was gramoxone Intian, and this is pre-gloss.
Oh, gotcha.
There's a bunch of different products, yeah.
Okay.
A 2017 systematic review by The Lancet found that in 16 countries which experienced total bans on pesticide sales, all but one country experienced decreased numbers of suicides from pesticide ingestion, and that country was Greece, but they're a higher income country, so their deaths by pesticides were probably lower overall. And so if they didn't see a decreased number in pesticides, it's probably because they just didn't have that many to begin with. But in Sri Lanka, there was an estimated 93,000 suicides prevented in the 20 years leading up to 2015. And in South Korea, there was more than a 50% decrease in pesticide suicides in the 3 years following their ban.
Wow.
Yeah, so if you don't make it super easy to kill yourself with something, people don't tend to kill themselves that way.
Right.
Also, according to The Lancet and the information upon which they initiated their 2017 study,
first, if a means of suicide is not immediately accessible at the moment of suicidal crisis, suicidal feelings might subside before alternative means can be accessed. Second, people deterred from using one method of suicide might instead use a less lethal alternative, thereby increasing the chances of survival. Less than 10% of people who survive a suicide attempt go on to take their lives at a later date. Third, if a method is less frequently used, it might be less likely to be reported in the media, thereby reducing the cognitive availability of the method.
Right. So make it less prevalent and people are less likely to kill themselves with it. It's not that hard.
Right.
And one of the places that has not put many restrictions on it is, of course, the United States. More than 10 million pounds of Paraquat were sprayed on corn, soybeans, grapes, and other fruits and vegetables in 2018 in the United States. And according to a USGS survey data, Paraquat use has been on the rise since 2013. It's not super readily accessible in the United States as it is in some countries because it can only be purchased by certified applicators, so farmers using it.
Commercial agricultural use.
Yeah.
Essentially, right? I can't go into my Home Depot and buy some Paraquat.
Exactly. Yeah.
Gotcha.
And it is mostly prohibited for aerial application, but it's still allowed at some level, though. That's awesome. And there's additional safety information on the label. But overall, I think the studies I was reading was saying that, the safety information doesn't really do a whole lot. It might keep that farmer from, storing it in an improper bottle, but it's not going to keep, a kid who can't read from, ingesting it on accident or somebody who wants to kill themselves. You have to make it inaccessible. You can't just put on a carton of cigarettes that this will kill you because nobody cares. But yeah, that's kind of the point. But the U.S. has not banned Paraquat entirely because the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act uses a cost-benefit analysis a la Jack's Company and Fight Club that allows the EPA to overlook the harms of a pesticide like Paraquat if it provides significant economic benefit. And Paraquat is considered to be extremely beneficial because it can kill weeds which have grown resistant to other pesticides like Roundup. So in 2018, Haling had already left ICI at this point, I think, and he went on to get his doctorate in toxicology. And he discovered that ICI, or Syngenta at this point, was still misrepresenting data to make it seem safer, and the FAO of the UN was still using the PP796 at the 0.05% level as the standard for safety, despite the fact that he went to his superiors and was like, this is not standard whatsoever. And I think what's important is the misrepresentation, because you asked me, what do you think about this earlier? So this is what I think about this. We've already talked about how using emetics for gastric decontamination in the EpiCac episode, it's not recommended anymore. If it's caustic going down, it's going to be caustic coming back up.
Right.
And that's kind of what you were saying.
It's just going to cause more damage.
It's just going to cause more damage. And Syngenta has used this to make a counter argument against Haling, and they wrote to The Intercept, where Sharon Lerner did some reporting on Paraquat as well, and they said that, quote,
today, eminent medical experts advise against high emetic levels based on concerns that they can increase toxicity. Medical opinion has evolved in the 30 years since John first worked on this product.
And yeah, It has. But
It
it doesn't mean that, like, in the 70s they were doing right. 30 years ago they knew they were doing shady science.
Right. And they well and not to forget how long they were just like, let's just not do anything.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
also to not forget that.
Right.
Like
It's going to be too
it's not like they were
expensive.
super interested in finding a solution in the fucking first place. But
Right. So, yeah, I don't necessarily think that the emetic is the solution. I think what is more criminal is that they knew thousands of people were dying from their product and they didn't want to do anything at all to make it any
exactly.
safer. Yeah.
Exactly. Like they literally did nothing.
Mm-hmm.
They literally were just like it was like they were thinking, how long can we get away with this?
Right. Yeah.
Because money is great and we'd like more of that, please.
We would like more of it. Yeah.
So you said that there's not an antidote, but what can facilitate recovery, if anything?
Well, a complete recovery is possible if less than 20 milligrams per kilogram is ingested. So a pretty small amount would be survivable if the victim received proper airway management and decontamination, gastric lavage, possible intubation, hemodialysis, and if the inflammatory response that could lead to lung fibrosis is suppressed, which is a lot of ifs. Like, this is not something you want to fuck around with.
Right. Like that's a huge if. And also like I imagine that you would have to get this help pretty quickly
Pretty
in
quickly.
order for it to have full effect.
Yeah, yeah. And there could still be long-lasting consequences of exposure, even if you survive this exposure. So individuals exposed via inhalation can develop lung scarring and have pulmonary issues for years following a survived exposure, or just like a low, chronic exposure. But there's also neurological issues associated with low-level exposure. As of December of 2022, there were 2,352 plaintiffs in the federal multi-district litigation class action lawsuit against Syngenta because they had developed Parkinson's disease as a result of exposure of Paraquat, specifically exposure to gramoxone. In fact, so many plaintiffs were being added to the lawsuit every month that they had to postpone the bellwether test trial until October of 2023 so that they could finish putting together lists and deposition of expert witnesses. And evidence of a correlation between Paraquat exposure and Parkinson's first emerged in 1985 publicly when a Canadian neurologist named Andre Barbeau found that farmers as young as 32 were starting to exhibit symptoms of a neurodegenerative disorder. And a 1990 study found that not only was there a strong connection between exposure and Parkinson's, but that the people who had been exposed were actually 6 times more likely than non-exposed people to develop the disease. And this is what actually led to the EU banning Paraquat for use as a pesticide in 2007. Paraquat is banned in China and Switzerland as well, and this is where Syngenta and its parent company, ChemChina, are headquartered. So they can't even use it.
Use it in their headquarters.
Yeah, and the EU...
That's crazy.
Yeah, the EU will produce it and export it, but they won't use it there.
Huh.
But what's worse is that internal documentation from Syngenta shows that they knew about the connection between Paraquat and Parkinson's and that they covered it up.
Ugh.
And of course
they fucking did. Of course. Why am I going to act surprised? I'm not surprised at this. Like, I've been doing this show long enough that I should not be fucking surprised by this.
Of course.
Of course they covered it, though.
And actually, like, even after all of this, like, all of the studies came out, and even with the trial that's coming up, they still deny that there's even a connection between Parkinson's disease and their products. They completely deny it.
I think it's really interesting that they will not shit where they eat.
Yeah.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
you know what I'm
really
saying?
telling.
Like,
yeah,
it's really telling. Like, yeah, we'll make it, but we're not using that here.
That's
no, thank
here.
you.
No,
no, thank you.
Send it off to some of those poor countries that buy a ton of it.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, that's it. There were, 12 people dead among thousands of people killed accidentally or intentionally by Paraquat since the 60s. The Oronamin C poisoner was never found, and no one's really taken the blame for any of the deaths. Yay, capitalism.
The biggest criminal of all. Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please like, follow, subscribe, and review us everywhere you get your podcasts.
For more Lethal Dose content, you can find us at Lethal Dose Pod on Instagram, Tumblr, and TikTok.
For an overdose of content, subscribe on Patreon for exclusive episodes and much more.
The show theme is Look Far by our dear wizard friend Fogweaver. More of their music can be found on bandcamp.com.
Lethal Dose is created, researched, produced, and edited by Kayla Woods and Bina Steineko. Stay safe, and remember,
the dose makes the poison.